Diplomacy Light
Podcast.
What is knowledge in a diplomatic context? And what are the bits of data, diplomatic data, that become information? And how does that information become knowledge? And ultimately, how is that knowledge used by policymakers to make wise decisions? This is the topic of our discussion of the 8th episode of the DiplomacyLight podcast. It is with Diplo's own, Dr. Jovan Kurbalija, and with the director of the UN office in Geneva's library, Francesco Pisano.
Dear colleagues, thank you very much, Francesco, Jovan, for coming to the DiplomacyLight podcast. We've chosen a topic that to diplomats perhaps is very apparent, but I think to many non-diplomats need not be so immediately. And that is this combination of diplomacy and knowledge. How knowledge is created, how is it used in a diplomatic setting. And specifically, since I think we've all three been exposed to multilateral diplomacy, I think that in this sense, in multilateral diplomacy, there's a very unique way of doing that. So let's jump right in. What I would just say before we do is to give perhaps a slight primer on what we mean when we were saying knowledge in this setting. And a very easy kind of classification is one that is used in information and communication technologies. And that is this between what is data and then what is information and what is then knowledge. There is another one, and that is wisdom, but we'll get perhaps to that near the end. Let's start with this. So data in a multilateral setting, I would just say, is any event, anything, any piece of information that happens. It can be a non-paper by a chair. It can be something that is circulated among others. It becomes information when it becomes put into a given context. And that context can be different, but this is what makes it really information. When we get to knowledge, I think this is where the human element is most apparent. It's how humans use knowledge, how they use rather information to create knowledge. So, Francesco, if I may start with you, you are the director of the library of the UN office in Geneva. It is the place where, in a multilateral setting, we have kept the collective memory, including from the end of World War I, of the League of Nations. But even today, the UN office in Geneva, when so many different aspects of multilateral work going on, there is a lot of knowledge that is being created. Can you please share a bit your insights from looking in from there?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. Thank you for having me on this podcast. I think your primer is excellent in the sense that there is a fundamental link between diplomacy, the practice of diplomacy, and information and knowledge. We are a center of multilateral knowledge since 1919. This library was created in 1919 together with the archives, which is a peculiarity in the world of information management, because normally the business of libraries and the business of archives and records management are two different industries. But in our case, we accumulate that, and it was done on purpose to create this body of knowledge. We talk about body of knowledge. So there is a part that we do as any other scientific library, which is to accumulate knowledge and look after collection integrity for everything and anything that is multilateral and international law. That is our duty as a scientific library, as if we were a scientific library in a large research institute, for example. But then there is this other component that is entirely devoted to the practice of multilateral diplomacy in the UN, and before the UN, the League of Nations. And that consists of curating and maintaining and preserving a body of knowledge that is integral to the practice of the multilateral diplomacy, and also a trace of history. So basically, there is a lot. I conceive of data and information as things that are in our backs, whereas knowledge and wisdom, and I would like to talk later what lies beyond wisdom, are more forward-looking. And so at any given time, the consumer of information and knowledge is placed on a timeline where data and information are behind that observer, and the production of knowledge and the application of wisdom lies before the observer, and should allow the observer to make what we call informed or wise decisions. And that is the fundamental challenge of diplomacy in action, when you look at how decisions are made based on what kind of wisdom and using which shared values. And so when we look at all that, if you zoom out, we locate ourselves in the center of that area. That is an area of knowledge and practice at the same time. So this is how I view basically the cartography of how library and archives of the UN today exist after a long history, because after all, the library and archives pre-exist the UN. They were there in 1919. And the entire building that you both know very well was built to accommodate the League of Nations long before the UN.
Thank you, Francesco. And Jovan, if I may continue right on this thread that we've set, you've looked at the history of development of diplomacy, and with that, not just how knowledge is created, but really the evolution of diplomacy. At one point, diplomacy as an institution decided to have a foreign policy. I'm talking about it as if it is an entity, but we can look at it that way. Foreign ministries didn't exist before, and at one moment they were created in a way to manage the archives, to manage what agreements were made. Technology has changed that in several ways, but the constant has remained of what knowledge is and how it's created and how it is used. Can you perhaps share your insights on this?
Sure, Ljupčo. Thank you for inviting me, and it's a really great honor to be with Francesco, who owns the post and job, which is my favorite job in International Geneva. But since we are on the same age, I cannot wait for his retirement to take it over. But what is fascinating in Francesco's work is this passion about job, which these days is not very often, but you can see when you go to the UN Library of Geneva. Therefore, congratulations, Francesco, and great to be today with you here. Ljupčo, let me just go further back in the history and highlight this interplay between archives, storing, saving knowledge, and diplomacy. We go back to Talamarna diplomacy. Well, it was almost 3,400 years where you have the first diplomatic archive. It was the archive obviously collected on the stones at that time, but you have note verbals, you have the sort of nice phrases of introduction, praising, exchanging gifts, things that you have today. Fast forward, Renaissance Italy, medieval Italy, the first embassy was established in order to manage archive. Forward to our time, to the first Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as you indicated, in France, the ministry was built around archive. And then we have what Francesco explained, League of Nations and development of archive and library. And it didn't come just the pure coincidence. It was a spirit of time of relying on science, knowledge, and other issues. And here I will just add on this, let's say, data knowledge, information knowledge, on wisdom side, and add another aspect. By comparing two peace treaties, Vienna Peace Congress 1814-15 and Versailles. Vienna Peace Congress, you have Metternich and Talleyrand making great parties for 1 year, basically socializing ideas and creating emotional bonding among negotiators. 5 big powers, Prussia, Russia, England, France, who was the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And they create more or less peace, which holds with many wars, troubles, turbulences, till the First World War. We have the end of the First World War and big belief in trust in science and human rationality. And you have in Versailles, basically in 1819, scientists negotiating the peace. What should be exact formula for the reparation that Germany should pay? What should be exact formula for this and that? We know what happened after that. And this is important caveat and message, that we should rely on knowledge, we should rely on information and data, but we should not carried away by the idea that that by itself will bring a peace and solution of the conflicts. There is that layer of wisdom, emotions, something which is, frankly speaking, paradoxical. When you rely on knowledge, as I do, and all of us in this meeting, this is how we were brought into our educational life, with some sort of Mediterranean, sort of healthy skepticism and skills for managing paradoxes. You have all of that, and suddenly some podcast tells you, hey guys, forget it. It doesn't mean to forget. We have to rely on knowledge. We have to rely on rich resources like, let's say, UNOG library, one of my favorite libraries on diplomacy. But we have to be always careful what we can achieve with that. And this is where the wisdom emotions start.
As multilateral diplomats, as diplomats in general, we don't do a good job of explaining what we do. I think that for many looking from the outside, looking at diplomacy, it's, flute glasses and cocktails, and that is actually an essential part of it. And we should not be shy to say it, because that is about socialization. That is about an ambassador and other diplomats below the rank of ambassador socializing with their colleagues, so that even when there is trouble, they can do that. To go back to the Congress of Vienna, Metternich did as well. Talleyrand brought in the best chef in France to host the dinners that were there. And it was to a great degree because of those that it was necessary first on the French side to be able to still be a player, even though it was after Napoleon and they were kind of the losers of that. They were still a player. Would you share the same sentiment that there is this value of sharing this common space, creating knowledge? And this is the key thing, creating this common knowledge in these relaxed circumstances, and it's not just about the papers. Francesco, perhaps first with you, but Jovan, please jump in as well if you wish.
Well, I think the creation of knowledge has changed a lot over the last maybe 30, 40 years. Whereas from the examples that Jovan was mentioning until the emergence of social media, basically, the process was always the same. Everybody knows the data, information, knowledge, wisdom pyramid, and everybody knows that pyramid. And if listeners don't know it, a simple Google search will show it to them. And that basically goes as follows: data is the raw elements or the raw ingredients, if you wish, and information is the combination of cleaned and checked data sets that basically add context and meaning. So information means meaning. And so if you compare it to, since you brought in the Mediterranean, if you compare it to making a meal, data is the ingredients and information is the recipe, basically is putting that together, is the meal. And then knowledge is already a form of first metabolism, because you have to process the information. And that starts giving you insights and the beginning of understanding. But it's just the beginning. Then after the distillation or the digestion of the meal, this is where you have knowledge production. So that is very interesting, because that moment has changed radically, because now knowledge is horizontalized through our society. And so you can find it, knowledge meaning what we know. Knowledge is what we know, right? And so what we know used to be geographically located in libraries and archives. And Jovan said it before, we have entire foreign services that were born around the place of the knowledge storage, basically. But what is today accessible is the knowledge that exists throughout world population, plus library and archives in basically real time, which is amazing. And that is the fundamental challenge to the diplomat of today, because this knowledge is now accessible to everyone and can be interrogated live. So how long will it take before important official meetings among member states of the UN and other international organizations will introduce Twitter live surveys to see what is the sentiment out there? What is really the thought of the majority of people? And so that is, I think, is a fundamental challenge that can only be resolved by looking one step beyond. What is the metabolism of knowledge? And that is what I call wisdom. And wisdom in international relations is inseparable from values. And values need leadership. And today, these two ingredients are dramatically lacking in the international community. And let me be clear about it. Leadership and values are dramatically lacking in the international arena. And in all the eras that brought change to international relations were value-based. Right or wrong, or outdated or not, those values were there. And today we're lacking that.
Yeah, it really, if you look at that time, many will perhaps, let's say 19th century, it's about perhaps major powers, raw power, but really it's also the time of setting diplomatic etiquette, of bon ton, of what are acceptable ways and means of communicating and keeping it. Jovan, on once we've kind of gone into the realm of wisdom and given, as Francesco did, the important play and role of technology, specifically, let's say, the internet. We've seen, as we've discussed before, two trends in this. One is really the initial ideals of the internet, where it was really seen as a liberating space. We've also seen really, one would call it stupidification, unfortunately, through social media, through all kinds of things being taken out that are not always conducive. And that is humanity. We deal with it as it is. But it is exactly, I think, what Francesco is saying, then it is up to leadership to point the way with a moral compass. Okay, this is how we need to go. This is where we can create wisdom, which is based on values, as properly Francesco said. Jovan, would you agree?
Yes, no. Let me start with yes. Let's bring some sort of dynamics in our discussion. On a strong yes side, to your comment and Francesco's, yes, internet is amplifier. It's amplifier of good and bad. We started, and I shared a bit of that utopia. I started in the 90s with the idea that internet will make life, humanity better, prosper. And I do my digital confessions from time to time by checking my emails and blog posts from the 20, 30 years ago. But that's some element of utopia is needed in society. We need to look for a bit of illusions. And what we're seeing currently is the very different internet. Internet in the center of geopolitics, internet in the center of tensions, amplifier of not only of good but also bad, and various people trying to fix it, including Elon Musk recently trying to fix Twitter. That would be interesting. He managed to make Tesla car, he managed to do SpaceX, but I guess this problem is much more demanding to fix the Twitter than to launch the satellite into orbit. On the no side, conditioned no side, I'm always a believer that diplomacy should be and must be about communication, engagement, and exchange. That's what is for our body, blood, for diplomacy is communication. Therefore, that would be the first aim. The second aim would be values. Obviously, if we can communicate and share the same values, that's great. But I'm afraid that there are now tensions between different value systems. And not necessarily on the level of core values, protecting on human life, dignity, that's basically shared. But when it comes down to the more specifics, we have differences which are sometimes manipulated, but sometimes are genuine. And this is a big tension of the internet and diplomacy, which are both global exercises. They're global in its claim and activity, but they're very local in its impact. Therefore, that element of global, local have to be managed carefully. I would give a slight advantage or slight sort of, if we have to choose, ideally we shouldn't choose, to communication, comparing to the forcing the values. They were bringing people in the same room, maybe giving them some good food as Metternich did, and telling, hey, you are humans, you represent your nations from few thousand in Pacific to 1.5 billion in China. You have to sort out these issues, whatever issues are, war and peace, climate change, digital and other issues. That would be just a slight comment on that importance of communication engagement in diplomacy.
Jovan, if I can follow up on that, we've discussed this in an informal setting when COVID happened and started closing off not just borders, but really multilateral meetings. It was not possible to hold any meetings, and there was a moment of pause. Everybody kind of froze, stayed at home, obviously, but then work needed to continue, and it did. There were different technologies that were readily available, Zoom, WebEx, but one aspect of that is that these are private companies, right, with their own servers. So all of a sudden we've moved from the creation of this knowledge in what I would call perhaps an international public sphere, to play with Habermas's kind of idea. So where the UN General Assembly, the Council chambers in Geneva, Room 20, where the Human Rights Council is, where these ideas are negotiated and communicated live between people, all of a sudden it became possible to do it through technologies, and that was perhaps necessary. But we shouldn't forget, these were private companies with private servers on which this knowledge was created. And this can be brought in many different areas, but specifically for multilateral diplomacy, what would you say, Jovan, to start off, and Francesco, please feel free, what would you say about this privatization of this international public sphere?
Ljupčo, this is one of the, my pet projects and the hobbies in this discussion. First of all, companies provided a great support for humanity in difficult time. They provided business continuity. Therefore, we should always keep things in the context. And it was, if we keep moving, we continue, probably more or less efficiently. We can discuss that online. But one issue which is of utmost importance, and I'm still surprised how member states and UN are not addressing it, is that you should have the online meetings in a space which is not public in means of openness. It could be open, but publicly owned open source space. Like you don't meet in the private hotel for Security Council or for the Room 20 or to UN General Assembly. You meet at the UN premises. You meet at the UN premises, and on very symbolical level, there should be open source space developed by people all over the world, by contributing, like they contribute in the Palais or in the New York with the stature of Denmark fix one room or Kazakhstan fix the other room in the UN in Geneva. That's possible to have a contribution, to have some sort of Linux for the global meetings, where we can have open source platforms, when we have data and knowledge, and this is key of our discussion, stored in secure spaces, protected by immunities. And there is a symbolic level of having UN meetings online, like in situ, into the public space owned by humanity, owned by the UN. And there is a functional level that the knowledge generated by these meetings is stored legally in protected space, let's say by immunities, but also space that you can capitalize. Bit of shocking news is that it is not that difficult to develop. There are open source components, Jitsi, there is very vibrant open source community. I have been trying it for 2 years, but so far I've failed to pull it through. One of the reasons was that for me it was so obvious, and then I talk to diplomats and others, and I said, how do you don't realize it? Now I was a bit emotionally and politically naive in that. I have probably to put more efforts to explain these simple three things. Symbolic importance, meet in the public space. Second, store the knowledge in the legally protected space. And third, it can be done as a global, inclusive activity of open source community, some sort of Linux for UN or diplomacy.
Francesco, what would you think about, not necessarily perhaps this as a project as well, but your thoughts on this period that we've just witnessed and the possibilities of providing a public space, perhaps through technology, coming up?
Well, I think first of all, to put things in context, I agree with Jovan. We should mind the context. Now, seen from inside the UN, it was very clear that the context was, first of all, a crisis response context. Crisis for COVID, the effects of a pandemic on the multilateral diplomacy arena. So it was in that context of crisis response that the UN went to those tools to hold meetings, notwithstanding the situation. So I do not see the privatization. It was not lived and perceived like that. So it was simply going to the tool for business continuity. And here I agree with you. But there was this business continuity, alerts were flashing all over. How do we do that? How shall we not stop important processes that were taking place? The second context is the multilateralism is in transition. Has been for a while. The mix that we use to do multilateralism has become outdated because it was designed to promote a globalization race where problems were understood as domestic impediments. And now you have global problems. And so it doesn't work. The mix is inadequate. So that transition became apparent. It was revealed by the effect of COVID in a whole new light. So what we have ahead of us is probably a tension between classical diplomacy, really Westphalian diplomacy, state-centric delegation dynamics, wanting to restore in-person meetings. And there are many, many reasons that one should go that way. So just simply bring back delegations into the spaces that were designed for that, Room 20, the assembly halls, etc. That is in tension with another thing, because the multilateralism transition that we're experiencing calls for other components to be added. And so I think the tension will be going back into the rooms with a dynamic that has been known and crafted in the 19th century, and going forward to a hybrid meeting formats that accept inputs and interaction with other bodies of knowledge and other representatives of those bodies of knowledge. It's not so revolutionary. We've done it before. This is how we created the Sustainable Development Agenda 2030. It was not the classical process. It was a hybrid process. So if we could plug into that new emerging process and refine it and plug into Jovan's ideas and even pet project, then we would be going the direction that I personally see as the direction of the new multilateralism. I'm known for saying we should stop talking about the future of multilateralism and we should begin to talk about the multilateralism of the future, because these are two different things. So what was the future of steamboats in the 19th century is completely different than talking about how do we fly from a continent to another, because it's not linear development. There is a jump in there. There is a design for purpose jump. And that is the magical word. What keeps multilateralism together through its transition is not wisdom, it's purpose. And so we could share some values and we could disagree on other values. But if the purpose is shared, then the success is in the bag. And we have an organization that works like that. It's called CERN. And no matter the differences, the purpose is one can be written in one paragraph, it is accepted by all. And the purpose of the international community today could be as clear as defeating climate change, solving the migration crisis, and putting an end to the escalation of inequalities. These three together could consist in the purpose of the new multilateralism. Today we are on this side of that fence. We haven't made that jump. Time is running short. Calls come from academia and the social actors with incredible insistence. Yet, in many rooms, is business as usual. That is the fundamental challenge, I think, for diplomats of today, not of the future, of today.
It's interesting that you mentioned CERN. If you remember, when I was chairing the group of governmental experts on lethal autonomous weapon systems, it was in the middle of COVID, my second chairmanship, and obviously there wasn't a possibility to meet. I put this video, and one of the three aspects in the video that I put is CERN, to remind exactly of this, that there is in Geneva an example of international problem solving, of the scientific method used in a collective manner where different ideas are put into the knowledge mix in order to solve problems. And I've always looked at multilateral really through that prism. If it needs to solve problems. Now, here we come into several, I think, issues that hamper that. One is, as you say, Francesco, the way we've done things, and that is a big obstacle. But it's not the only one. Another, I think, is the fact that everybody gets stuck into national positions. And if you remember, Francesco, when I was a guest at your podcast, we spoke about this, how it is really more important to look at interests than it is to look at positions. And I think many countries in multilateral settings are given by their foreign ministry a set of instructions, and they don't communicate back, well, let's perhaps try to change this and that, because they're afraid of being blamed, as is often the case, of being there too long. This is in diplomacy, this thing. He or she has been there, wherever that is, a bilateral posting or a multilateral, too long. They're starting to see things from that perspective and not from our national position perspective. But actually, this is exactly what we need. We need this perspective that is common. This is open for either of the two of you. Whichever wants to jump in, please do.
What brings to mind, I'll go first, because what brings to mind is something that I've read not so long ago, which is under the umbrella of the consideration of the new diplomat. And I read the following things. In future, diplomats as a community of professionals will be tasked with the incredible responsibility to be the connectors between the logic of governments and the reality of people as in the peoples of the world. Because who in the end is going to tell government of country A how people really feel in continent C? Diplomats. And that role that compensates the dire execution of capital instructions, and it really balances out and brings reality, the real reality, into government. And going back to the chain, the pyramid we were mentioning before, data, information, knowledge, wisdom, purpose. And I think that is very, very, very close to what probably diplomats will be doing in the future of an international society that will be ultra connected, ultra live, yet with processes that are traditionally delegation based, but immersed in a bath of knowledge that evolves at the speed of light. I believe that diplomacy has a bright future in after the transition. But we have to take the transition by the horns. We have to take it with courage. And I wonder when diplomats will rise and say there is more to it than capitals are asking us for.
Jovan,
Sure.
please.
We completely agreed, Francesco, I guess, Ljupčo and all, that diplomacy as a profession has a bright future because the world is interdependent. Well, people try to solve conflicts by military force, as we are seeing these days, but I think there will be more and more limits to that. But what Francesco said, that diplomacy will be differently performed. And there are few dynamics that we have to follow carefully. This is the old one of dynamics between capital and embassy or delegation, people on the spot versus people in the headquarters. And you can recall the old anecdote with Jefferson, Jefferson was sent as ambassador to France, and the people in State Department said, hey, we haven't received anything from him for 6 months. We should ask him, how is he doing? It was, 2 centuries ago almost. And that was a different time. But now headquarters knows quite a lot what's going on in the particular country. But it doesn't know what is becoming increasingly important, these subtle elements, corridor talks, dynamics, dilemmas, this emotional layer, which Ivo Andrić, Nobel Prize winner and diplomat, developed lovely in his definition and description of diplomats. That's probably the first point that we have to keep in mind. The second point, which is important and we should not forget, is representation and symbolism. We live in era of identities, with all good or bad aspects. And diplomats are carriers of identity and symbolism and representation. On very, let's say, social responsible way, behind them, there is a country. There are people. From 1.5 billion in China to a few hundred thousands in Pacific Islands. But you represent somebody. And that element of representation should not be underestimated as we move more and more towards functional diplomacy. How to solve the problem, how to deal with issues. That element of the flag, and I'm representing my people, will become important, and I think we shouldn't underestimate. There may not be countries represented, 193 or whatever is the number of countries today. There may be local communities. We may go more and more towards medieval diplomacy, where you have the hundreds and hundreds of the local sort of entities going to negotiation, being represented, including in Westphalia. One of the big problems in Westphalia it was that you didn't know what to do with these 100 duchies or entities from the Holy Roman Empire. Therefore, I said, hey, let's put them together in some sort of states and manage it. Therefore, those are two aspects which we have to follow carefully as diplomacy evolves, as there is a major transition of the profession. And how is it going to happen? Probably, I like to quote Hemingway here, when they asked him how he got to bankrupt. His business went bankrupt in Cuba. And his answer was in two ways, gradually and suddenly. That will be probably how we'll be seeing gradual changes and then sudden changes, like, let's say, COVID-19 brought online meetings. We have been discussing it for Ljupčo knows, for 2 decades, online meetings, and then you suddenly, the next one morning, people were online, learning how to adjust, to use it, to have business continuity. Therefore, that would be a reflection.
Thank you. Francesco and Jovan, please feel free to as well, some concluding thoughts on how do we do this exactly? How do we go from the gradual has been happening? Do we need to wait for something sudden to happen? A war is happening on European soil at the moment, which is a very devastating war. Do we really as humans need these kinds of wake-up calls, this punctured equilibrium? Or can we get to this place and use the knowledge of the past to better inform our future and to solve the problems that are quite substantial? How do we do it?
Well, I pass difficult questions to Francesco.
Well, my concluding thought would be that if we look at data information in our possession, there are only two ways for international relations to go to the next level. One, we always use the first, and the first is is to conflagration and big suffering. This is how we create the only two global organizations we have had. And so we live in fear that there may be another San Francisco moment. A San Francisco moment doesn't mean the good side of the conference San Francisco, meaning what provoked that. The San Francisco moment is a global trauma. But there is another way that we know exists, but we didn't practice, which is the way of elevating wisdom through purpose and going around our tendency to violence and elevating. So there is San Francisco moments, and then there is elevation. After all, the history of our species is a history of attempts to elevate ourselves. Our ancestors went extinct at least twice. Homo erectus and Neanderthal went extinct. We are a different species. But is our civilization mature enough to go around the San Francisco moment and create a higher level of international relations? That is the question. I think it can be done, but not without checking the box of purpose. So the question in front of the general assemblies of all the international organizations should be item 1. What is the purpose? And that is my concluding thought.
Thank you, Francesco. Jovan?
One important aspect is to put, these discussions in the broader context. And we have a cycles of the conflict and diplomacy and peace. Diplomacy is less celebrated than wars. If you go to any capital, European or world capital, you will have a streets of great generals, but you won't. Metternich has a small size street in Vienna. Although he contributed much more to the longevity of Austrian-Hungarian Empire than Eugen Savoysky or those big guys who were going around and extending the empire. Therefore, we have also to, as humanity, to say that to revitalize some concepts of being ethically superior, including the word of compromise. It's 4-letter word in many cultures. If you compromise, but compromise is ultimately ethically superior concept because you give the relevance to the other and you try to solve a conflict and tension with the other through some sort of negotiated deal. To do that, we need some sort of spaces where people can step back and reflect. Diplo has been doing it in our context. Francesco is doing it with UN Library a lot as physical space where you can go and reflect and see what is the purpose, what is the wider context in terms of history, where we are coming from, but more in terms of the future. And these spaces are badly needed. In terms of future, to revitalize ethical value of compromise and diplomacy. To see that we pass to the next generation, at least the intact world that it exists, it's not ruined. And to pass also the cultural heritage that we inherited from our predecessors. And here are the libraries and knowledge, and it's not given because there is now currently a big fight for the patterns of human knowledge, sort of privatization of data and AI. Basically, we can say one day that somebody will come to me, like it comes to some of my photos which were privatized on the tech platforms. They'll say, hey, this what you mentioned, it's Aristotle's thought from Nicomachetics, but this is now owned by our company because we provide the platform. You always add that. Therefore, this is a big battle. Are we going to keep the open, common heritage patterns of what we inherited through books, through Shakespeare, Dostoevsky, Petrarca, whatever, philosophy, to the next generation? Therefore, it is decisive moment, and I think the UN realized that, the UN Secretary General, by starting the process of our common agenda and preparing for the meeting for future and the question also of the rights of future generation. One of the proposals they have been making is that at any UN meeting we have empty chair, which is the chair of the future generation, that we should be reminded that as we negotiate climate change, peace, digital, whatever, there is somebody who is not present yet in the room, but whose interest we should protect, at least being aware of it, but then protect as much as we can envisage it. That would be, I think, my conclusion of the role of diplomats and diplomacy to foster that great dialogue or social contract that we started negotiating, and we have to negotiate in the coming years. It won't be signed on the dotted line, but it will be shared understanding of purpose, core values, and the way how we can realize it.
Thank you very much to both. Perhaps to conclude on my side, and as by thanking you for this great conversation, and just perhaps touching on a couple of things. This is a great idea, the great concept, I think, Jovan, of the empty chair. If you look at the key concepts, from the past, sustainable development, which Francesco mentioned, actually, this is a key element of what sustainable development is. There's two compromises, there's two tensions in sustainable development as an idea. One is for economic development, and the other is for environmental protection. And that tension is sustainable development, what it tries to resolve. The other is actually this intergenerational tension between present generations and future generations. And I think, Jovan, it's a great idea to have some kind of a symbolic way of reminding us that we are also working this for the future generations. And multilateral and diplomacy in general looks for the long term. If we look at 100 years back, this idea of Wilson, of open covenants openly arrived at, has materialized to a great degree. Some of it is in the public archives, some of it is in the international negotiations in UN rooms, but there's also this element that we mentioned of having it at dinners where people feel more comfortable to discuss ideas and to find solutions. And I think it's all about that, about the compromises that are necessary to find solutions for the future. Thank you very much to both of you for coming to the Diplomacy Light podcast. It was a great conversation, but I wouldn't expect anything less from brilliant minds like the two of you. Thank you.